Now, across the Wadi Abu Sufyan, we see over here on the other side of Hierkonpolis, two sites that we're going to focus on extensively, and it's what you read about today from the Baba et al. Article, and that's HK11 and HK6. Now, HK11 represents a 7-hectare occupation with multiple different activity areas. There are houses within Operation G that show numerous phases of occupation. They're all rectangular, and much like the house at HK29, it's surrounded by wood and reed fences, and they have the same domestic and productive activities. So people are making clothing in terms of textiles, they're producing their own stone tools, making pottery, they're practicing animal husbandry and agriculture, they're hunting and they're fishing. So we see a large-scale domestic operation that looks much like what we see associated with the larger town over here on the other side of the Wadi. So HK11 appears to be a relatively small settlement on the fringes of a larger occupation here during the Nakata 2 phase. But HK11 also has something like what we saw at HK24, two large-scale breweries. Operation B at HK11 found a concentration of kilns and a bunch of pottery tools suggesting the industrialized production of ceramics. And the ceramics that were being produced here are those large beer brewing vessels. 5 vats north of these kilns were found built into the ground, and they had the spent grain residues found in the bottom of the jars. And that means that all the grain that was used in the fermentation process, it settles into the bottom. And think about if you've ever drank an unfiltered beer, you get that layer of sediment at the bottom of it. That's what we see here. The spent grain is floating, it kind of sinks to the bottom. Now, in many societies in the world today, this is used as animal fodder or as fuel for fires. That's likely what's happening here as well. But we see the spent grain residues inside of these breweries. Now, we can see a similar thing found at Operation A, which is what you see here. These parallel rows of vats that are sunk into the ground. Taken together between Operation A and Operation B, we're probably producing about 50 gallons of beer a week. And again, to put this in terms of things that you are all familiar with, think about 30 kegs. So if this was kind of in constant use, we can see this being supporting a large-scale population. But the question really when we start to look at HK11 is one that Baba had, is what are we doing with all of this? Where is this beer? Because it's 2 kilometers on the other side of the Wadi from the large settlement. And we have probably a relatively small occupation working in these operations in these areas. So we're not talking about a huge settlement. They're producing more beer here than what would have needed to provide for the daily food for the occupations at HK11. Now, we also see the idea here from Baba et al. About the production within Operation C, where they argue that the meat here is being produced somewhere else. We have all these kind of hearths, and the objects, the remains that we find here of cattle and Nile perch are the remains without the meat. It's the heads, it's the tails, it's the hooves. So their argument is this is a location of food processing. So the question then becomes with HK11 and HK6 is where is all this large amount of beer and food going? And the archaeologists excavating at Hierkonpolis have basically argued it's going to HK6, the necropolis. So far there have been about 60 excavated tombs within the complex at HK6, and what we find are mud brick or stone lined tombs that are surrounded by wooden post holes that would have created a large mausoleum. We know that cedar imported from Lebanon is likely being used for the construction, and inside of the burials we find elaborate grave goods, substantial prestige items like cosmetic palettes, imported pottery from the lower Egypt, or wine jars from the Levant, stone figurines, statues, and exotic animals. Now, what the archaeologists working here today are basically arguing is that the food and the alcohol that's being produced at HK11 were all being funneled into the royal ceremonies, into the storage facilities adjacent to the tombs. So they're bringing all of that food and alcohol here to feast with the dead or to inter the pharaohs, or the leaders here, not pharaohs, within society. And so when we kind of look at the layout here at HK6 in the tombs, we see something that is incredibly kind of familiar. It's this large above ground mausoleum. It wouldn't have been something where you kind of inter the dead and leave them. This would have been something you could have visited. And then if we kind of think back to HK29, the control over nature is really emphasized here at HK6. You can kind of see the layout here of Tomb 16, the central component surrounded by the mausoleum. But here you can see all the animals that are buried with the leader here, and things like elephants and hippopotamus and Nile crocodile and gazelle and lions and leopards, right, are all being included here in the burials. And again, I think this is a way to kind of look at this and see that this is an occupation here, an expression of the leader's control over nature, because these animals were being kept alive. One of the hippopotamus bones shows extensive trauma to one of the hind legs, where it had been basically tied to a post and kept alive. So we kind of think about the leader here at Hierkonpolis may even have been keeping something like a zoo of these animals as symbols of power and control over nature, to express their authority over everyone in society. So when we kind of look at the representations within this, we see a lot of exotic goods coming from all over the world. We see lapis lazuli, for example, that's coming from Afghanistan. Those trade networks with Mesopotamia, again, are bringing goods from all over the world into this. So if we kind of look at one of these structures, you can see seashells from the Red Sea, ivory from Central Africa, and we start to see the earliest portraitures. There are numerous examples of broken statuettes within this. So what you can kind of look at this based on the reconstructions is that you have a mausoleum here that would have been surrounded by a low fence and brightly decorated and colored and painted wood. That each of these leaders successfully would have, or elites members of society would have had kind of a standout mausoleum that would have separated themselves from everyone else. Now, the other thing that we see surrounding this, right, is that around the necropolis, unfortunately for the individuals involved, there are also human sacrifices. When the leader died, they tended to take their wife and children with them, or at the very least servants, into the grave. So we have individuals who are buried, sacrificed, to be interred with the leaders of Hierkonpolis around this. So you're taking the entire menagerie of animals, you're taking the people into the present, and you're basically providing the leader with everything they need to have a productive afterlife. That includes elite prestige objects, as well as people and animals and food, all of which the food and drink all are being produced at the site of HK11.